Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me. In my last video, I was playing around with this Stamptember 2022 set by Tim Holtz and Simon Says Stamp, and I was playing around with my watercolor pencils for the first time. So I've decided to try them again, this time using them to watercolor an image in. So I'm using the Santa stamp from the same set that I used in my last video. And I wanted to create a beautiful night sky behind him, as well as just testing out the pens or the pencils with watercoloring directly onto an image. So I'm stamping with Versamark ink, which is a sticky ink, and I'm embossing with some black embossing powder. Just remember, if you get powder where you don't want it, use a soft brush to brush it off before you melt the powder with an embossing tool. If you don't do that, the powder will just melt to the paper and you'll have whatever that mark is on that card permanently. So I am using watercolor paper here because I'm doing some watercoloring. I'm using the stencil that comes with this set. I'm just going to put some snowflakes in the sky that will create a little bit of a resist with the watercolor pencils. Needed to wait for that to dry 100%, so this is the next day. I'm using speckled egg behind the image here, so I have a lighter area closer to the image. All of the colors and all of the supplies that I'm using will be linked down below in the description. So if there's anything that you're curious about, it'll be written down there. So I'm just using my watercolor brush again this time. I really liked how it added a lot of water to the image. I typically use a watercolor pen that has the water in the handle, but for what I was doing here, this was working a little bit better. So the next color I'm using is Salty Ocean. Now these are colors that I wouldn't typically use for this type of image, but because I have just the one set of these watercolor pencils, I'm a little bit limited with colors. Likely we'll get the other two sets just because I'm the type of person that I'm a completist. I just want the whole sets. But for right now, this is just going to be perfect. Last color that I'm using in the sky is Villainous Potion. And once again, it's not a color I typically would use for a sky because it's a purple, but it works really well here. And it makes a really nice dark area when blended with the Salty Ocean. Now I like using the watercolor pencils in this way a lot better than in my last video when I used it direct to paper. I find I get a lot more color this way. And the colors blend really nice. The paint is quite creamy, if that makes any sense. The Distress reinkers that I typically will use for watercoloring are quite transparent. They've got a lot of color to them, but they don't really have any opacity to them. So these watercolor pencils seem to have a little bit more opacity than the reinkers. So they're great for this. Now I'm using the speckled egg to add just a little bit of shadow to the snow part of the image, as well as to the fur around Santa's hat and on his coat. It'll just give it a little bit of a shadow. So the next color that I'm using is peeled paint. I'm going to add a little bit of green to the trees. I'm not coloring them completely green. I want to have a little bit of lighter areas and white areas for snow. So I'm just basically putting the darkest of the color towards the center and then blending it out a little bit. Any place that I want the color to be a little bit darker, I'm just taking that color from the pencil and I'm just dotting it right onto the area, and it makes the color a little bit darker. It gives it a little bit of a shadow. Typically I'd use two different shades of similar colors for this, but because of the limited palette, this will work just fine. Now at the beginning, I stamped and embossed this image with some black embossing powder. You don't actually really need to emboss when you're doing watercolor. You can use just a permanent ink like a StazOn or archival ink. That will work as well. The one thing that you have to keep in mind though is if you do use if you just stamp the image and don't emboss it, you don't have the ridges to keep the paint separated between other colors. So if you go too close to each other with opposite colors, they will start to blend and bleed into each other. The way to avoid this is let one area dry before you paint the other area beside it. Just something to keep in mind. There's really no right way. Both ways work just as well. It's a personal preference thing, but you do want to make sure if you're using two different colors in areas close to each other that you let one area dry first before you go and do the other one. Now I'm doing fired brick here. I'm going to paint the brick on the little chimney. Now, because this set doesn't actually have a really nice red, when I go to do the Santa sack and his coat and pants, I'm going to use this fired brick, and then I'm also going to use the picked raspberry to give it a bit of a pinker tone to brighten up the red a little bit. Fired brick's got a little bit of an orange tone to it, and I also didn't want the chimney and Santa to be exactly the same color. So now I'm going back in with speckled egg and just adding a little bit of shadow to the fur on Santa's coat and hat. I think I might have missed that before. Now I'm taking the picked raspberry and I'm going to do a base layer on the coat and the Santa sack and pants. And like I said before, I'm going to do the pink layer first, and then I'm going to go over top of it with the fired brick just to give that red more of a bright tone than the chimney. Now, it actually worked out fairly well. I wasn't sure when I was doing it how it would turn out, but I actually really quite liked how it turned out. I do go back a couple times between the colors just to mix them a little bit on the paper. But it's a great way to change up the color of something. If you have a limited palette, you can just use a couple different shades to blend together and get a new paint color. So as I'm working through it, I'm making the bottom part of this sack and the bottom part of Santa's coat a little bit darker than the top part. Light would be coming from the top, so the top would be naturally a little bit of a lighter shade. Just gives it a little bit more dimension by doing this. And like I said, you can go back and forth between the colors to mix them on the watercolor paper. And the other thing you can do is just dot paints in place just to make that color tone a little bit darker. It just gives a more concentrated color in that area, and it works well for shading. Now I'm taking walnut stain and I'm going to paint the ladder that's going up to the chimney. And I'm also going to paint the side of the house with that same color. Once again, lighter areas where the light would be hitting it, and darker areas where there would be more of a shadow. So the side of the house would be below the eaves, so there would be a shadow there, so that's going to be a little bit darker as well. Now, once the image is completely painted, you need to make sure that everything is dried well before we go on to the next step. I'm going to take some ink colors and I'm going to blend around the edges just to deepen the edges and give it kind of more of a frame. So the first color I'm using is Uncharted Mariner, and I'm going to do a shadow around the sky. And it really kind of eliminates the purple tone to the Villainous Potion that I have at the top, and it gives it more of a dark blue look to it. You can do as much or as little shading as you want. I tend to do a little bit more on the corners, so it kind of turns out into a little bit of a oval. It rounds the picture out a little bit. I'm using some forest moss on the sides by the trees. And then I'm using some walnut stain at the bottom where the house is. You could use one color and do the entire circumference of your image with the one color. I just chose to do colors that were similar to what the image was. So I've got some pieces of cardstock for my mats already pre-cut. My card is going to be 5 by 7, and I have a black mat on a white card first, and then the next mat is navy, and then I'm going to put my image piece down in the center. Now, when I have all my pieces down, I'm going to use an acrylic block to hold it all down so that everything stays nice and flat and in place while it is drying. Sometimes when you watercolor with watercolor paper, the paper tends to curve, and by drying or by holding it down while everything is glued in place, that flattens everything right out. So I'm going to add a sentiment to the bottom corner, and I've got it stamped in Versamark, and I'm just going to emboss it with gold powder. And once again, if you get any powder anywhere that you don't want it to be, make sure to brush it off with a soft brush before melting your powder with your embossing tool. And now I'm cutting the sentiment down a little bit. I decided I wanted to frame the sentiment in gold, so I'm going to use some foundry wax to do that. In the end, I actually squirt out far too much because some of the foundry wax must have dried in the nozzle. So I going to use that with a splatter brush to add some stars to the night sky, and it looks really, really good. I'm really happy with how it turned out. I actually wish that I hadn't glued down the mats yet, because if I hadn't, I would use some of that excess foundry wax to add some of this to the edge of the black mat to have it mimic the edge of the sentiment. But because all these pieces are glued down and dried, that's not possible. It is what it is. You live and learn. I might make another card that is very, very similar, but add the foundry wax to the edges of the mats as well, just to see what that looks like. I love using this this splatter brush because it adds a really nice splatter. It doesn't have a spray pattern. Often when you use like a toothbrush and a comb or whatever, you get a distinct pattern to it. And this splatter brush, you don't have that, which is awesome. It also cleans up super, super easy with some isopropyl alcohol. So you don't have to worry about having stained foundry wax on your surface. You want to use a heat tool, the same embossing gun that we used for embossing our image, on the foundry wax. And what that's going to do is going to have the leafing come to the surface, and it really makes those pieces shine. When the foundry wax dries on its own, it has kind of a dull matte look to it. And the heat gun, just like I said, it makes the leafing come to the surface, and it totally makes those pieces shine. And the stars in the sky of this particular card look really, really cool. So I've got that sentiment in the bottom corner there. I raised it with some foam pop dots so that the sentiment was a little bit more dimensional. And now I'm taking some Stickles to add a little bit of sparkle to the trees. I just felt that the snow needed a tiny little bit. I'm not doing it on the whole roof of the house. It's just going on the trees just to add a little bit of sparkle there. Once again, once that is done, you need to wait for it to completely dry before doing anything else to your card. I'm also adding it to the fur lining or the fur trim on Santa's hat and coat. And it really just added the perfect amount of shimmer that twinkles in the light when you look at the card. So here is the finished piece. Really happy with how it turned out and love the watercolor pencils for this. Have a great day.